Thank you, John. Sure. So thanks, John, for inviting me to this and being part of the planning effort. It was really interesting. And I've always said that my favorite meetings to attend are the ones where I learn more than anybody in the room. And that might very well be the case today because I have an interest in what goes on with the microbiome. I think it's a fascinating area of research, but I'm not expert in it. So I'm likely to be the recipient of a lot of good knowledge today. So I'd like to talk about where the microbiome fits or is not fitting in the policy picture. And John made a very good point in that slide he showed of food systems, that food systems, of course, involve everything from what gets planted in a field to what people consume, what people waste, and everything in between. It's a complex system. Very few people understand the whole thing because it's hard to understand. There's a lot of expertise needed to do that, but boy, is it important to do that, because working on an isolated part of it without understanding the other parts leads to important gaps in information, including in the policy picture. So one of the questions that I would like to address here is, where is the microbiome in the policy discussion? And should it be in an elevated place compared to where it is? And in some ways, it's sort of like, where's Waldo? You know, is it out there? Can we find it? Is it anywhere to be seen? Is it hidden among other bigger things? And the question of those things is, I think, pretty much yes, that you're not hearing much about the microbiome yet. And I think that's a problem. So I'd like to discuss the work we're doing in the World Food Policy Center here at Duke and tell you how we came to do that work. And that might help explain where I believe the microbiome might fit in the policy picture. So I came to Duke 6.5 years ago after more than 20 years at Yale University. And while I was there, I directed this center called the Rudd Center. And the Rudd Center, we dealt with public health, nutrition, and obesity prevention primarily, working on things like what you see here listed on the slide. There have been some very significant victories in this space. Schools don't look anything like they used to look like with respect to the food picture. Schools used to have lots more fast food, lots more soft drink vending machines, lots more rewarding kids with food, counting books that taught young children to count with M&Ms and Skittles and things like that. Homework reward programs with certificates to Dunkin' Donuts, things like that. Not all of that is gone, but the situation has really changed. The state attorneys general have done some very interesting things in this space that I think have created important victories. And then one of the areas where there has been significant progress is in soda taxes. And that's an area that I've been involved in for a number of years. Going back about 30 years, we began writing about soda taxes. In 2009, with Tom Frieden, who at the time was the health commissioner of New York City, later became the head of the CDC, we wrote this paper making a public health case for using sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, and then later that same year wrote a longer piece that had an economic argument join the public health argument for why taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages might be in order. Now, 30 years ago, when the idea first got introduced, it was lampooned, it was ignored, it was attacked, but nobody took the idea very seriously, even though a little bit of science, including things that we did, began to accumulate. That picture is really different now. And so there are now taxes in more than 50 countries around the world, including, major countries in different parts of the world, in Africa, in South America, in Asia, and in the United States, in Mexico. So you see taxes in lots of different places, and the research on this has shown quite positive impacts on reduction of sugar-sweetened beverage intake. And we can talk more about that if you'd like. In the US, there are a number of taxes in smaller and larger cities, and now there are several states considering statewide soda taxes. So these all have been victories, but they've mainly been in one isolated silo of the food systems picture: public health, nutrition, and obesity prevention. and didn't really connect with agriculture, let's say, or with work on food insecurity, work on food safety, food defense issues. And that created, in my own mind, this gap where we weren't understanding what was going on in other fields weren't understanding what was going on in ours, and that leaves a lot of problems. One is policy gaps, second is competition for resources, and third is the inability to put together larger coalitions of voices arguing for policy change that you might otherwise have if these areas were connected. And hence, that's why we created the World Food Policy Center that works as a bridge across these areas. So rather than recreating depth on any one of these topics, our goal is to be a bridge across them. And it is our hypothesis, and so far we're finding this to be true, that there is policy magic to be had at the intersection of these areas. But because the areas aren't talking, that magic is largely unexplored. So we believe that by trying to understand these things, we can learn more than just by working intensively in one area. Now, it's on one hand very daunting because it's hard to be good at one thing, much less a bunch of them. But on the other hand, it's the most interesting thing I've ever done. And the connection, for example, of work on the soil and human microbiomes would be an example of where these fields might come together and do interesting work. So, of course, it's important to get food right. This paper that came out in Lancet looked at the 10 leading risk factors for diseases, combining data from countries all around the world, and food is essentially implicated in almost every one. I mean, there are a few where it's not, but almost every one it's strongly implicated. So getting food right is important for human health. It's also important for the environment and for the well-being of the world. If you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, these are the ones, and you can see how food would be involved in lots of different places here. The vitality of the land, the vitality of the sea, chronic disease, and of course food insecurity are issues that are just woven throughout all of this. And so food is very important, but it's a complicated picture, and I'll try to give some examples of exactly why that's the case. So for example, Sustainable Development Goal 2 is what you see listed here. And as you read this, pause for a minute and think about whether the pieces in there are in competition with one another. So for example, ending hunger, this is to be done by the year 2030, according to this goal. Achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. So as I'll show you in a moment, there are a lot more people entering the world scene as population continues to grow. It's already hard to feed the world, even though at the moment there's enough food to do so, and it's a political and economic problem. But can all those people ever be fed without using industrial forms of agriculture that produce large amounts of food in small spaces, but do so at the expense of the environment? Well, who knows? But it's an interesting question. But to have a goal, a stated goal, of ending world hunger by 2030 is remarkable given how big the problem is. So let's talk about two of those four areas that I was discussing bridging. There will be discussions about agriculture later, so I won't talk about that. And some people know a lot more about that than I do. But we'll talk about food insecurity and obesity. So let's put this in an international context. So the numbers right now are that 822 million people are chronically undernourished with devastating consequences. This slide that comes from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations talks about the pathways between food insecurity and negative health outcomes. So as we uncover part of it, we can see that the food insecurity leads to uncertain access to foods. That creates both behavioral and physical problems, then leading, and this is all pretty self-evident, leading to the issues you see here, and then finally going to the outcomes, which are child stunting, chronic undernutrition, micronutrient and macronutrient deficiencies, and overweight and obesity. Now, if you look at this, a really interesting question is, where's the microbiome? And is the microbiome being considered in these kind of discussions? Well, hardly at all. But of course, chronic undernutrition will affect the microbiome. Who knows what the long-term consequences of that might be, but it certainly is a very important biological outcome of chronic undernutrition and needs to be considered in the picture. So I'm going to try to make the argument now that there's too little discussion of the microbiome in policy circles. My guess, although that's not my world, is that they're probably in the work in the microbiome. There's not a lot of discussion about policy, and it would be great to bring those two together. Now, if we look at expected population growth, given those large numbers of people chronically undernourished, one can imagine it's only likely to get worse rather than better. And there are some stunning numbers about how much food needs to get produced in order to feed the world. So this is a really interesting statistic. So I'll just let you look at this and think about what it means. Now, it's hard to imagine this would be true, but somebody did the estimates, and it's really pretty alarming that this much food will have to get produced. And again, at what cost? And will the food be good for human health? Will it nourish the microbiome rather than to undermine it? Now, there is some good news that if you look at trends in chronic malnourishment around the world, the numbers beginning, going back to the 1960s and then going forward to about 2015, the numbers were showing steady decline. Now, that's good news, but what it means is the numbers went from appalling levels to slightly less appalling levels, but still progress was being made until 2015 when the numbers started to go back up. So not just a blip in the numbers, but a steady increase from 2015. And this report that comes from, again, the FAO, said that achieving the 2030 zero hunger goal is virtually impossible. And how could it be otherwise given those trends and given the strain on the system? So understanding what chronic malnourishment means is really important. And of course, malnourishment isn't just occurring outside the U.S., it's happening right here in Durham, and it's happening in places in Chapel Hill and in Raleigh and rural North Carolina and the whole country. So it's important to get this right. And as I'll discuss later, this is a particularly important issue for child development. Let me talk for a moment about obesity. Now, there are a lot of people in the room here who know an awful lot about obesity. So I won't go into anything basic, but talk about some world trends. So back in 2006, we published this picture that, this paper that looked at projections in rates of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, of course, is caused mainly by obesity, in the US and China and India. And during that time, the expectation was that there would be a 36% increase in diabetes in the US, which of course very alarming given the high base rates that occur already. But in China, the numbers were expected to be like this, and in India, the numbers expected to be like this. And of course, given the large size of the populations, you can see what kind of a strain this would put on the world healthcare system. Just last week, a report was issued by a group in London called World Obesity that does a lot of excellent work. And just to give you an example of how striking this picture is I looked at the expectations in rates of childhood obesity in the US and in China, expected in year 2030. So in children ages 5 to 9, here's what the numbers are expected to look like. So not only is China catching up to us, which at one point people would have considered inconceivable, but it looks like by 2030 they will surpass us. And the number of cases, of course, given the population denominators here, are absolutely stunning. So obesity is a big problem, of course, and the question is, how much discussion is there in policy circles about what to be done about obesity, and in discussions of its causes and consequences, where's the microbiome? Now it's there, certainly people in this room discuss it, but if I go to any policy meeting on what can be done in the US or elsewhere about obesity, it's pretty unlikely that the microbiome will come up at all, much less in a big way. Now, another feature of this picture that I think is really interesting is work on ultra-processed foods. And this concept, the term, was created by this researcher in Brazil, Carlos Monteiro, who's done some terrific work on this, who basically made the point that the human body hasn't adapted fast enough to deal with rapidly changing food supplies. And the food supply now has foods that he calls ultra-processed. And his point is that these foods throw off the gut, they throw off the brain, and they really mess up human health. So he thinks of ultra-processed foods with this kind of a definition in mind. And of course, there are lots of foods in the food supply that are like this. In fact, it is now the case that the majority of calories that Americans eat come from ultra-processed foods. So what are these foods? Well, things like savory snacks, sugared cereals, processed meats, fast food, candy, sugared beverages, and even infant formula would fall into the category of processed foods. But of course, there are a lot more things than just that. You see some more examples here. And in our supermarkets, we have whole aisles that are devoted to nothing but ultra-processed foods. Now, to give you an example of how processed these things are, I'm going to show you an ingredient list and see if you can guess what food this is. All right, can anybody just venture a guess? It's not a trick question or anything. It's a common food. People will know of it. Pardon me? Bread. Not bread. Pardon me? I couldn't hear you. Cereal? No. Good guess, though. Could be. Anybody else? All right, so before I show you what it is, it's 46 different ingredients just in one food. And some is known about what some of these things do to the body, but not everything is known about what all these things do to the body. And this creates some big problems. And who knows what they do in combination? Well, this is what it happens to be. But of course, it could have been all those things that you mentioned. It's a concoction of chemicals, in a way, with some processed commodity crops. So what are the impacts of consuming a diet like that? If this is now the majority of calories in the American diet, what does that mean? Well, let's talk about several studies that have been done on this. And one study came out not too long ago and got a fair bit of attention in the press, so you might have seen this. It was really a very well-controlled study by Kevin Hall and colleagues. Kevin's a scientist at the NIH, and they did a carefully controlled study in the NIH Clinical Research Center with 20 participants who were in the center, lived in the center for a 1-month period of time. They randomly assigned these 20 people to one of two dietary conditions. One, they got an unprocessed, ultra-processed diet first for 2 weeks, and then an unprocessed diet second, and the others, of course, got the reverse of this. So people were used as their own controls. Lots of different metabolic measures were taken. Weight, body fat, and things like that were observed, of course. The diet looked something like this. With the sort of foods I mentioned before, the unprocessed foods might be granola made with whole grains. It would be fruits and vegetables and things like that. So this is a relatively short-term study. The individuals were only on these two diets for 2 weeks each. So what would you expect in that period of time for body weight and body fat? Now again, people were just asked to eat ad lib. So no instructions on what to eat. Just eat whatever you want, eat until you feel full. And here's what happened in that relatively short period of time. Significant difference in calorie intake between the two conditions. And I'll give you the numbers in just a minute. Significant differences in body weight and significant differences in body fat mass change. And the people on the two diets reported feeling equally full and equally satisfied. So the people on the ultra-processed foods are consuming a diet much higher in calories. It's increasing their body weight, but they don't feel more full or more satisfied. And here are the numbers that compared to the unprocessed diet, the ultra-processed diet created a difference of 508 additional calories. This was per day. Over the time of the study, 2.64 pound weight difference, and you can see the body fat mass difference. So these are pretty significant changes over a period of time. Now, if these people had been in the clinical research center longer, who knows what would have occurred? Would their bodies have adjusted, intake came back to normal, come back to normal, and body weight would normalize? Well, probably not. Just look at the population. So that was a pretty striking study. The health effects of consuming a diet like this have been pretty interesting. So the epidemiologists now have tried to separate out the effects of foods that are ultra-processed from other dietary factors that have been studied over a long time: absolute calorie level, dietary fat, sugar in the diet, of course the composition of the diet with things like sugared beverages. And they found some pretty impressive things with this. This study that was done in France found, I think I need to move ahead. Yeah, here's the results of this. This was a study done in France, a prospective cohort study with 44,000 people. 24-hour dietary recalls were used, and they found, in addition to what previous research found with BMI and risk for cancer, risks for all-cause mortality. So the impact of these kind of diets on health seems to go beyond what the constituents, the nutrient constituents of the diet might be. And then I'm going to go back and show this slide that was a little bit out of sequence. This paper came out not too long ago talking about the Western diet, which is the ultra-processed diet, and its interaction with the microbiome and its role in metabolic disease. But these discussions aren't happening very much. There's certainly discussions of diet and its impact on the microbiome, where obesity fits in that picture, but not in the context of ultra-processed foods as far as I know, and that might be a nice addition to the discussion. So, as most of you probably know, these two issues that I've talked about, obesity and food insecurity, interact with one another. They're a common set of social drivers, poverty in particular. The dual burden or the double burden that's quite well known around the world has now been well documented. And it's known that early stunting experiences in children increases risk for obesity and diabetes later in life. Very important issues affecting vast numbers of people in the US and elsewhere. And then the question is, where's the microbiome in this picture? Are people discussing it in this context of the dual burden? There's discussion in the context of obesity, very little discussion as far as I can tell in the context of food insecurity, but how those two things interact with one another is especially interesting, and the microbiome might be a fascinating piece of that picture, and it would help to elevate that into the policy discussion. Food consumption patterns are changing around the world in very interesting ways, and there are lots of different studies on this and lots of different ways the diet is changing around the world. Increasing ultra-processed foods is one, increasing consumption of sugared beverages is another. But another interesting part is what's happening with meat consumption around the world. And increasing meat consumption is a real concern on all kinds of levels. There is the concern with human health, of course, because of saturated fat, elevated calorie intake. There's concern with water use around the world because creating meat is extremely water intensive compared to other forms of agriculture. And of course, the well-known impact of meat production on climate change. So there are a lot of reasons to worry about this. And if we look at Japan, for example, and look at seafood consumption going back to 1960 and projecting ahead to 2050, here's what the numbers look like. a profound change in what's going to be happening. This report came out again not long ago on charting Asia's protein journey, and they projected that meat and seafood consumption will rise, partly because of increasing population size, but also because the percentage of meat in the diet is changing, and that due to increased wealth and urbanization, these problems will continue to accelerate. And so the numbers that they put into this report projected meat and seafood consumption in Asia looks like this. And different countries are different colors in here, but when you add them all together, you see the total picture. So this is really pretty remarkable. Now, when you look at the climate change impact of this, that the land mass needed to create the increment in meat consumption, from what you see behind me here, amounts to approximately the land mass of India. So huge changes and stresses on the world to do this. So again, as we think about increasing meat consumption, where's the discussion of the microbiome? So I'd like to give you one example of something that we're quite interested in, where I think the microbiome would be a very interesting part of the picture. So about a year and a half ago, we held a meeting here at Duke that was a summit meeting with leaders from around the world on early child development and nutrition. And it was a fascinating meeting. And the brain development experts basically said that if you don't get nutrition right during childhood, that it amounts to a life sentence, that there are cognitive and other capabilities that can just never recover no matter what happens with nutrition. And there was a lot of discussion in here about the pathways by which poor nutrition in childhood has an impact on the child during childhood and later. And what we would create from this discussion would be something like this, that the combination of food and nutrients and then feeding practices that support or undermine the delivery of those foods and nutrients, like breastfeeding, for example, or responsive feeding, lead to a number of outcomes that in turn affect health and the other outcomes that you see there on the right. And the discussion mainly has been on these two things, on brain development and on cognitive function, and of course on body weight as well. And so the pathways then look something like this, that you get children, we're acting through the brains of the children, and that's what's creating these cognitive issues. But of course, there's another pathway that goes right through the gut, potentially. And at this meeting of leading experts on the topic, we didn't think to invite somebody who's an expert on the microbiome, a real deficit in my mind that we missed. But nobody else in that room, of all these experts on child development, ever brought up the microbiome. So one could go back to the original picture and then fill it in with these additional things, including the microbiome, and think of different pathways that these things affect health, which is one of my guesses that most people in this room would be concerned with, but also cognitive brain development, academic performance, social outcomes, and things like that a whole other world of researchers are concerned with on their own. So one thing that we believe would be really helpful, and we're not funded to do this yet, but we hope to be, is to develop a nutrition roadmap that would go all the way from preconception to age 8 and outline several different things during that time. Nutrient needs of the child, the foods likely to produce those nutrients, the feeding practices to support the delivery of those foods, and the policies that would support that whole picture. Now, this sounds like the sort of thing that somebody would have done, you would think. But just like our field is segmented a lot, that field is segmented as well. Whole world of people study breastfeeding. They tend not to interact with the people that study nutrition in schools. That group doesn't tend to interact with the people that are looking at maternal intake of nutrients during pregnancy. Another group of people might be looking at preconception. And so nobody has put together this picture enough in a comprehensive way that would do what I mentioned intending to do. So we could just take a slice of this as an example, the transition to solid foods, and one could put together a roadmap that would say, here are the nutrient priorities, the feeding practices, the policies, and everything in order to support nutrition at this time, but it needs to take into account what's happening at other times so you could create a nutrition roadmap. So at the end of the day, these food systems are fascinating, amazing, complicated, all those sort of things, but they're really important food challenges that face the world and face us right here in Durham and in North Carolina too. The question is how to best address those, and where does the microbiome fit in this picture? So what I'm hoping we can do today is that you can help me paint a picture of where's the microbiome. And if I can learn that, then I can take that message forward, and other policy people will hopefully get, not that I'm the ambassador for this or anything, but that other people can hear the message, and the policy discussions will now include a discussion of this. And people that work on the microbiome will start thinking of the policy implications of their work. I think that's very exciting. So I'd just like to end with a little plug. We have a podcast series that is part of our World Food Policy Center called The Leading Voices in Food. And we have clusters of podcasts on fascinating issues: food and faith, regenerative agriculture, food insecurity, international policies on these issues, all kinds of, we've got farmers, we've got scientists, we've got policymakers, all kinds of people that are in this. We've done about 60 podcasts so far, and they're really interesting. And I'd love to create a cluster of podcasts on the microbiome. And so if you have ideas of people you think would be good guests in that context, I would appreciate knowing. So again, thank you for having me, and I look forward to learning a lot more today, and congratulations, John and colleagues, for pulling off a great conference. Thank you.